I think we're ready to go ahead and get started. So thank you again for joining. I'm going to turn it over to Ash Beatty of Public Spend Forum to get started. Ash?
Great. Thanks, Anissa. Welcome again, everyone, to this series on the public procurement workforce. We're very excited to kick this series off with you today. This series is being presented by Public Spend Forum, and we're working in collaboration with NIGP. With joining me today in presenting the webinar is Jack Pellegrino, Director of Procurement at County of San Diego, and Raj Sharma, Chairman and CEO of Public Spend Forum.
Hi, glad to be with you. Morning.
Great, fantastic. And Raj, you're there as well, right?
Hello, everyone. This is Raj.
Okay, great. Let me just quickly tee up the webinar series and what it's about. This series is focused on helping procurement leaders, chief procurement officers, and acquisition executives understand the key skills and gaps of the public procurement workforce. And also, as we continue in the series after this webinar, we're also going to be moving forward on ways that organizations can deploy critical public procurement skills within their organization. This first webinar is going to be focused on what are the skills of a world-class public procurement workforce. Jack Pellegrino will also be providing us with a case study from County of San Diego. And then, of course, we're also going to share with you the results of a national survey of public procurement leaders in terms of how these leaders actually rate the competencies, which we'll be covering within their organizations. So that's the focus of today's webinar. We do have a second webinar in the series teed up, which is scheduled for April 24th. And very likely we'll have several more webinars in the series depending upon the areas of interest that you're most keenly focused in on. So we'll gauge those topics as we go, as the weeks and months go by. Slide 4, the agenda. I'll briefly just cover the agenda. So I'll begin with a brief rundown of the workforce model in public procurement. Before we get there, I'd like Raj Sharma to talk a little bit about Public Spend Forum for those of you that may not be familiar with Public Spend Forum. We'll then move on to the good stuff, and that is the case study from San Diego County that Jack will be presenting, as well as the survey results. And then I wanted to make sure that everyone knew that we'll be setting aside 30 minutes at the end of the webinar for questions. So please, in the meantime, as questions come up, feel free to type them into the chat window. And when we get to the Q&A section, we'll tee up the questions, and we'll hit them one by one, and we'll try to hit as many as we can in the time allotted. So for those of you that may not be familiar with Public Spend Forum, we are a market intelligence and best practices platform for public sector buyers and suppliers. And very specifically, we're focused on 3 key things: providing supplier and market knowledge and data. The second, best practice frameworks and standards, tools, and info on how to buy and how to improve. This particular topic that we're covering today on the public procurement workforce is one example of the best practice frameworks. And third, we're also a global community and network of peers and experts in public procurement. Let me move on to the following slide, slide 6, and I'll make this very brief. It's just so everyone knows what Public Spend Forum does. One of our key initiatives at Public Spend Forum is the Global Leaders Exchange for Public Procurement. It's a forum of chief procurement officers, procurement leaders, key acquisition professionals to come together and discuss best practices. We engage in deep research content. That's where the best practices comes from. We bring to the forefront best practices that organizations are implementing. We often have members present case studies of best practices. We meet regularly throughout the year to exchange perspectives on best practices and challenges faced within public procurement. We have a sampling of participants here on this screen. We have hundreds of people that participate in the Leaders Exchange, but just a few sample participants are shown here, such as the City of Washington, D.C. We have the County of Santa Clara, the County of San Diego, King County, Seattle, and various other jurisdictions. So we cut across the public sector from federal, state, local, county jurisdictions, and various other jurisdictions therein. So that's just a brief overview on the Public Spend Forum. What I'd like to do now is slide 8, please. I'd like to provide some background and context on the public procurement workforce competency model, and then I'll present the model itself, and we can see what competencies are laid out within the public procurement workforce model. By way of context, we began working on the workforce model a couple of years ago, And a couple of the key drivers in understanding what the need is in having a consistent model is that first, we want to acknowledge that the spending within the public sector with suppliers is enormous. Within the U.S. alone, it's $2 trillion. Globally, it's $8 trillion. So it's an enormous amount of spending with suppliers that goes on. That spending is actually critical to support the public sector organizational missions. And foundational to all of that is the skills underlying that within the public procurement workforce. What we found when we looked at this issue a couple of years back, and by the way, this topic on workforce competencies was one of the key topics that leaders within the public sector informed us about as being top of their agenda. But what we found was that there's no consistent and overarching competency model that informs how public procurement functions can lay out their organizations, the workforce, align the competencies therein. And there was nothing consistent that really existed. There are small models here and there that may be deployed in some subsectors within the public sector at large, but nothing consistent and overarching that was used as a means of informing public sector organizations. So a couple of years ago, we went down the path of developing the public procurement workforce competency model. We began our journey in working in collaboration with the Volcker Alliance. As part of that, we engaged pretty heavily with leaders, practitioners, academics across the public sector. We referenced a lot of the work that was already done, a lot of secondary research that was already out there so that we could benefit from the good work that others have already done in this area. And we brought that together into the initial version of the workforce model, which again was done through deep engagement with leaders, practitioners, academics, lots of leaders across the sector from federal, state, local, and so on. And then more recently, we've continued that engagement and evolved the model even more. Most notably, we recently conducted a focus group of public procurement leaders to further stress test the model to make sure it makes sense, it meets the needs of public procurement. And we've actually updated the model into a version 2.0, which I'll be presenting shortly. Before I get to the model, just a couple of things I wanted to highlight in terms of the work that we've done to date and the ongoing work in support of the public procurement workforce model. So far to date, we predicated the model on first understanding the public procurement needs and outcomes and how public procurement supports a broader organizational mission within their respective organizations. From that, we identified the core skills and competencies required to achieve the outcomes, and then ultimately, we took a look at what it takes to actually deploy the competencies within organizations, recognizing that not everybody in the public procurement organization, not every professional needs to be good at every single skill that's laid out. So the question is, what skills for what roles? And so we've spent quite a bit of time in thinking through a role alignment matrix, which we're continuing to socialize and get feedback from more broadly. So that's some of the work that we've already been doing in regards to the model itself. And on a go-forward basis, we're further engaging more broadly with public procurement associations across the sectors. We're working with various organizations to see what types of credentialing and tools will help support the model itself, will help support the skills and competencies required. And of course, this webinar series is another example of some of the ongoing work that we're doing in this area. Raj, Jack?
By the way, yes, I've joined. Apologies to everyone for having some audio difficulties. So Ash, continue, please.
Okay, great. Jack, anything to add before I jump into the model?
No, I think that was a great introduction. My first engagement with you guys was as the work that was done by the Volcker Alliance and the first report doing the people's businesses really was key for our first engagement since I was trying to benchmark what is world-class and how can I move my organization, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in some of the later slides.
Great. Let's move on to slide 11 then. There we go, slide 11, great. So slide 11 lays out the public procurement workforce competency model. We've identified 17 competencies through the effort over the last couple of years. These 17 competencies are organized into 4 groups. I'll very briefly describe each of the 4 groups so that we can then get on to the good stuff, that being the case study at San Diego and the results of the national survey. Group 1 on this slide that you can see are the set of competencies that are more so focused around following the set of rules and regulations and policies set forth for your respective jurisdiction. In the federal sector, there's obviously heavy focus on the federal acquisition regulations, the FAR guidelines. And then, of course, at the state, county, local level, there's going to be individual jurisdictional procedures that need to be followed that vary, from state to state, county, across localities, and so on. So Group 1 is heavily focused on the policies and regulations, a rigorous contracting process, and then overall program and project management of the procurement effort. So that, in a nutshell, is Group 1. Just wanted to give everyone a flavor of what's in each of these groups. Group 2, it says functional requirements and analytical skills. I'll describe this as the core set of foundational procurement skills that really define procurement as a function in terms of those procurement function specific skills that professionals need to have. These skills would be analogous to what skills does an accountant need to have in accounting, or a finance person in finance, and so on. And so we've broken this down into the full life cycle of procurement, all the way from developing requirements with your internal customers to performing various types of key procurement analyses, such as spend analyses, cost and price analysis, market analysis, and then all the way down the procurement life cycle into contract management and administration. So again, Group 2 is those set of skills that really define procurement as a professional function. Group 3 skills, they pick up where Group 2 leaves off. So it's one thing to have the Group 2 skills and be proficient, depending upon your role, of course, right? But Group 3 skills are the skills that enable a professional to take their core expertise and apply that across their organization and with the supply base in collaborating with internal customers as well as with suppliers, and developing that expertise of your internal customers, knowing what the different sets of customers, be it facilities, be it IT, be it HR, what their mission is, and ultimately what their procurement needs are from third-party suppliers. Likewise, on the market alignment and expertise side within Group 3, that's about understanding the different supply markets that you buy from and developing various areas of expertise within those supply markets, depending upon what your organization is buying and what's most mission critical. And of course, supplier engagement is part of that too. So Group 3 is really about this active level of engagement and alignment. Very different from the Group 2 set of core skills. Group 4 then, Group 4, by the way, is a notable addition going from the initial version of the model that we developed with the Volcker Alliance roughly 2 years ago to the most latest version. Group 4, in particular, leadership, communication, and driving change. There was a keen interest among public procurement leaders in having Group 4 added to the model, but not just generic descriptions of leadership, communication, driving change, but more so very specific to procurement functions and how public procurement organizations and professionals work across suppliers and, more importantly, internal within their organizations to lead, to communicate effectively, to change the way things are done, to meet, ultimately to meet mission goals. So that's what Group 4 is all about. We have descriptions for all 17 of these competencies within the 4 groups, and they're written up and they're elaborated on with a very keen eye toward the mission of procurement and how procurement collaborates across the entire public organization.
If I could add a couple of things. One is, I think as you look at this model, again, to some previous points that were made, the goal here really was to simplify the way we think about things. So, some of the other models, when we've looked at them, they have 100 competencies or just, what I would describe as a laundry list of proficiencies required. And what we found from a best practice standpoint, it's really critical to have a very simple structure and really a short list. And even this list is starting to get long, but it's much shorter than some of the other models that we had looked at before. So that's one thing. And then the second thing I would say, I know, Ash, this is probably coming up in a little bit, but even all of these skills, there's no one individual that can be an expert at all of these things. And I think we can all attest to that from our own experience. So the trick becomes understanding what your roles are and what skills are required within those roles and at some level of maturity that you are in your career. So that's really critical. So, our guidance a lot of times is that per individual, there are probably only 2 or 3 things you can be really, really good at. And then there might be other things you need to also obviously be proficient at. So those are a couple of the points that I wanted to make, that really need to have a shorter list. And then 2, even within that list, we can't have everyone be an expert at every single thing.
Great. And if the points that Raj made, if they're of interest to you, and they actually should be, because it's the only way to really take a competency framework such as this and deploy it within your organization. Webinar number 2, toward the end of April, actually takes a deep dive into the role competency alignment matrix, and that is addressing how can these competencies be deployed. And obviously the first answer is, well, we need to define what our roles are within the procurement function first and see which roles we want to align with which set of competencies. And so that's a critical part of actually deploying a model such as this. I'll also comment on one more point that Raj made, and that is that if you have a competency model that has 200 different competencies or sub-competencies, 200 to 300 or so, it becomes very difficult to work off of those. It becomes difficult to implement them. I think parts of those models can be implemented, but in terms of the practicality of aligning the set of competencies with roles, it helps tremendously to begin with a small list of relatable competencies that everyone sees the need for on a regular basis, and align those with the roles. And then, of course, at the organizational level, you can always break down in whatever detail. So cost and price analysis for one organization may only go to some level of detail, whereas for an organization which is heavily reliant on buying things such as defense system platforms, it may go down to a much deeper level, much more detailed level. But the goal, again, of this competency framework was to provide a common grounding across the public sector that defines what those critical competencies are in public procurement. And the organization herein, putting these competencies into the 4 groups, hopefully helps to illuminate the relevance of each of these groupings of competencies as well. Great. Slide 12. So Jack, would you mind walking us through the case study at San Diego and how you've taken the competency model and began to deploy it within San Diego County?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Ash and Raj. Thank you for those introductory comments. One of the things, again, I will emphasize is when I first became engaged with your organization as the new director here at the County of San Diego, I was looking for a way to benchmark ourselves and to find out and apply those competency models against my framework here in the county and how I was doing business to see what areas I needed to improve on. So that was really, Raj, your comments about simplifying the approach was really critical to how we started here. Is we could not focus on all, many of the associations have a competency model, or I'll call it a body of knowledge that is hundreds of items. And like Ash said, none of us can be an expert in everything, but we need to know, we need to have a calibration of what we need to get better at in order to achieve that going forward. So let me first give you a 30-second thumbnail of my background, and then I'll cover chart 13 here. I have been in the government procurement space for over 37 years. Have had the good fortune of leading and participating in procurement organizations and contracting organizations in 4 major companies. 3 were commercial in the aerospace industry with TRW, used aircraft, and most recently with SAIC for 19 years. And then I joined the county in 2013, as I said, as the Director of Purchasing and Contracting. A little bit about the County of San Diego. We're tucked in here, this beautiful little corner in the southwestern part of the United States. We're the second largest county in California, fifth in the U.S. by population. Our budget, when I first took the job, took my breath away. Our annual budget for the whole county is $5.6 billion per fiscal year, and this was the part that really took my breath away. Is our spend is a little bit over $1 billion a year, and you can see some of the numbers there. We issue about 1,500 new contracts a year, and we have because our contracts are typically single-year contract with option years, so they span typically the life cycle of 5 years. I have a total portfolio of a little bit over 3,000 contracts with the corresponding spend. When I came aboard, we were recognized by both internally and externally as an outstanding purchasing organization. And when I was brought aboard, one of the county initiatives, as well as the executives that I spoke to, wanted to take their vision was to take both the county and our organization to a new level of professionalism, customer service, internal customer service, transparency, and basically world-class governing, and to be recognized as the best-run government in not only in the U.S. but beyond. So that was really my first, I'll call it, reach out to Public Spend Forum, and when I started to read the Volcker Alliance Competency Model, it was a natural fit for us to use that model as we started this journey. My organization is pretty lean for what we do. I have a 56 staff, total staff. 38 of those staff are delegated procurement with delegated procurement authority. I am also responsible in the county for our records management program. And one addition to the slide I need to add next time is we also have property disposal, and we do that through a contract that we have a contractor that does our auctioning of surplus property. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we began our journey. Began our journey back in 2013 when I joined the organization, and it was really as I formed my new vision for the organization. It was based on feedback from our internal customers as far as what they envisioned would be the best organization to serve their business needs. What was very clear in those interviews is that because we live, procurement and purchasing lives in a world of regulations and rules and protocols, there was a need for not only clarity but consistency in our interpretation and alignment of those procurement tools and practices to the actual business needs of each of my clients. Clearly, an organization our size, we have 5 groups and we have 40 individual departments within those 5 groups, and they deliver. Their requirements are vast as far as the types of goods and services they need on a daily basis. Everything from IT services, consulting services. We do renovations to buildings. We do new construction. We do animal services. We do voting, register of voters. We do social services. So really, what I put together is a set of, I realigned how we put our procurement teams together. And rather than being a typical first in, first out procurement organization where we would get a requisition and you would get assigned to one of the 38 individuals, I realigned our teams to focus on individual group customers and departments within those groups, because they were naturally, I'll call it, consolidated into they were in a group that was like-minded. For example, public safety, we had probation group in there, we have the sheriff there, we have the DA, public defender groups in that public safety group. And that allowed me to align our workload. So one of the first things we noticed right away is my staff became familiar with the types of products and services each of those customers needed on a routine basis. So I didn't have I'll call it a revolving chair where a customer comes with a need this month, and 3 months from now they come back for another need, and they're retraining someone on my staff because someone else on my team did that transaction with them or helped them with that contract. So that was sort of the proper alignment of our workload, and the competency model that you're going to see in a minute here that Ash described was really, we employed that to do our assessment of what was needed from my organization with the team that I have in place now, to identify what those knowledge gaps and skills were. With the end result is improving our delivery of customer service each and every day in providing the vital services and products that my departments need to service the over 2.5 million residents of San Diego County. Next chart, please. One of the natural byproducts of going through the exercise that we did was it actually got a discussion with my staff. Ash, I remember when you and Raj were here, having my executive leaders in the same room for a half a day, it really caused us to get on the same page, if you will, with what our expectations were, the strengths and weaknesses of the individual staff on our team, to come up with this vision of where should we go in the future. So that first dot point is really, I'll call it a side benefit of us going through this exercise. The individual competency ratings were valuable to us because we were able to set some standards as far as in the hierarchy of our positions, what the level of expectation is for knowledge and training for each of those. Again, as was stated earlier, it would be impractical for me to expect everyone on my team to know the body of knowledge that's out there in hundreds of areas. The team that I have, I call it a diversity of, I look for diversity in diversity of experience, diversity of skills, and the key thing that I look for is folks that are willing to continuously learn and continuously improve. So what we did as we went through the exercise of deploying the framework, we picked out the top 3 competencies that you'll see on the next page. We connected that to specific positions in my team, and then we came up with, I'll call it a set of actions to increase those competencies, and I'll be able to specifically talk to one of them on the next chart. Next chart, please. So this is a summary of when we brought our leadership team together from each of our 3 teams. This was our scores of how we came out. What the beauty of this was it gave us tangible results to focus on the areas of most important need. Clearly, I'd like to be at 4.0 across all these. Not a practical thing to do. So as you can see, we focused on the lowest averages. Requirements planning, they actually three of the four were in group 2 with the functional requirements and analytical skills. And then the last one was stakeholder engagement with market alignment. But it allowed us to very quickly come up with an action plan of how we are going to make tangible improvements in how we do business every day. Most notably, you'll see we focused on the requirements planning, the negotiations, and contracts management. Just last month, one of the actions that we had planned is to bring in an on-site negotiation training. And so my whole staff, we had someone come in and we gave it was a two-day negotiation class that did something really pretty cool. We actually had exercises and they negotiated against each other as teams, and that was videotaped. And so people were able to see how they actually operated in a negotiation. They had a scenario, and one was the buyer and one was the seller with a set of facts. And so I'm very excited to have done that, and I'd like to redo this. I plan to redo this assessment, several months from now, and see. I would hope to see that negotiation number was going to come way up as a result of some of the training, like I said, we just delivered. Throughout the rest of this fiscal year, I'm going to be planning additional activities to address those other weaknesses that we had, or at least the lowest one.
Hey, Jack, I had a comment. So just one thing I found interesting here was that I think you all were very, let's say, self-aware as an organization in terms of where you are, and realistic about it. Because I think a lot of times I would just advise everyone that when this is, especially if this is an exercise you're doing to really help your organization and your people, it's important to be as critical as possible. And as much as we want to be positive in a setting like this, it's important to, one, really understand and know where each of these competencies, what a 4 might mean, and do your best not to inflate the scores, because if you can be really honest about that, and then you're likely to end up in a place where you can really help the team. So I think, Jack, and the conversation among your team was really refreshing and very honest, and that's what I found to be kind of the best part about it.
Yeah, that's a perfect point, Raj, and thank you for that. It really is a culture that we've adopted here, not only in my department but within the county, is that we are a continually improving and learning organization, recognizing as things evolve, we need to evolve with those times and expectations. And you're right, a lot of times we can think, well, we're pretty good at things. But then when you ask your customers what their view is, there's often a gap between what I call, maybe your reality or their reality and what you think is where you're at. So that's the first thing, is to do this assessment in a trusting manner with your team members, with your leadership team, that we're not inflating those scores. So, but we know we're on a journey. Again, it's setting a journey towards a better result. let's
By
see,
the
I
way,
guess.
Jack, sorry, I just saw a question I just wanted to bring in that Brian Smith asked. I'm just going to read it verbatim. And Jack, on the competency survey results, while you asked how well does your procurement function demonstrate each of these, not all of them are equally important in any particular agency. For example, negotiation was scored low, so you worked on it because it was important at your agency. At mine, my group doesn't do that, so it wouldn't necessarily be as urgent priority. And so in your surveying, were you also asking how important is that function to them?
Yes, a great point. This model is adaptable, and I'll call it scalable. Adaptable to each and every organization. For example, contracts management in my organization, my organization is responsible for helping the customer develop their requirement, employing a solicitation tool, and getting the contract in place. The reason negotiations are important for me is per our county charter, as the purchasing agent, I have to make a determination of fair and reasonable price determination of the final contract. So negotiations are a critical skill for us. Contract management, after we award the contract, is then delegated to the responsible organization. So although we scored a little bit higher on contract management, that is a function that I'm more of a support function in day-to-day contract management than I am a doer, if you will. So great point, great question, that you can take this model and prioritize of the 17 competencies you can and the groupings, implement it as it makes priority to your organization.
Jack, I'd like to add one thing to that. Again, that's a really good question that was asked. What we found in working through the competency model and talking to leaders across different procurement functions across the public sector is that depending upon what organization you're in, the role of procurement and the charter of procurement, the things that procurement is asked to do and focus on versus not do, vary significantly. So down to the specific organization level, the competencies that are most important is going to vary significantly and be heavily influenced by what that procurement function within that one organization, within the city, within the state, the county, is chartered to do. And of course, that could evolve over time, incidentally. And by the way, we see the same thing in the private sector. I didn't mention this before, but we also looked at private sector analogs to see what themes might be useful and relevant and applicable to the public sector. And so we see that everywhere and across organizations, be it public sector or private sector. It depends on the charter of the procurement function entirely. And so obviously, when you come up with what roles do I need within my procurement function, that also is obviously going to be heavily influenced by what the procurement function is asked to do. So I just wanted to, just underscore that point and just acknowledge that, that question is very relevant and that we're going to see that pop up throughout all discussions around public procurement skills and competencies.
Yeah, exactly right, Ash. For example, my sister organization, the City of San Diego, has they're a chartered city. The director there, Christina, has a much different role and responsibility than what I have here in the county. So her competency, the areas that she's going to focus on would be different than what I am focusing on in this role. So, want to move to the next chart, please? So as I indicated, I got our senior leaders together, and Raj and Ash facilitated the meeting with my senior leaders. And what you see on the bottom of the chart is our family of procurement roles in my organization. I'm pleased to say that since that last time you were here, Ash and Raj, we have simplified this structure. When you look at the difference between the series, between a contracting officer series and a procurement specialist series, there is a fair amount of overlap between the two. And so working with our HR department, we have been able to simplify this, and we've actually eliminated one of these, the assistant procurement specialists, to make them, I'll call it, more broadband. So simplified the series into one series now instead of having two separate series. So then what we did for each of those individual, I'll call it, procurement roles, we walked across the competencies that we thought was critical, and I'll put made an assessment of how proficient or what skill sets were necessary for that position. So that's what you see there as the representation across both the two axes on this chart. What I want to emphasize with this chart is this has become our roadmap for the supervisors when they do performance goal setting for our individual staff. So for example, if you're a procurement specialist, you looking at this roadmap, doing an individual assessment with, we might have 7 or so procurement specialists. Each of those staff would have an individual developmental plan against this, these competencies. Some of them obviously would meet our level of proficiency that we would expect for that position. Some are still in developmental mode. But it really is a great framework to have a meaningful conversation with each and individual staff member as far as what is their individual development needs. So that's the real power for this. Then I can help them seek out the best training, the best experience, the best exposure, so they can become, I'll call it, more increase their abilities within my organization. I can say from staff was pleased, individual staff contributors were pleased to see this, because often they were having a discussion with their supervisor, and the discussion was missing something. It would be they would say, well, how can I improve? And there wasn't, in not all cases, did our management team, our managers, have a clear vision of what that answer should be. The competency model has, I'll call it, improved that discussion on both sides, both from a leadership point of view and an individual staff point of view of what is their roadmap for a promotion or for higher functioning within our organization. Next chart, please.
Looks like I'm up. Jack, thanks so much for that. That was really helpful to see how you're actually taking the competency model, deploying it, and then all of the detail around how it's helping the organization from the leadership level all the way to the staff level, and how it's used on a day-to-day basis. That's very helpful. Thanks again for that.
Sure.
What I'd like to do now is talk about the National Survey of Leaders. We took the competency model. Next slide, please. Okay, perfect. We're exactly where we want to be, slide 19. We actually recently surveyed national leaders, procurement leaders across jurisdictions across the country, state, local, county, etc. We put out the 17 competencies, and we asked the leaders to rate their organizations relative to each of the 17 competencies. To take a step back for a second, our goal for this survey was a couple of things. One, to develop a baseline of the procurement workforce broadly that helps inform procurement leaders like yourselves in regards to strategies and actions for workforce development, and provide a robust set of benchmark data which represents, or at least starts to collect a representation of U.S. national data across procurement functions and how leaders self-rate themselves, their organizations, relative to these competencies. Having said that, the question that was asked earlier is very, very relevant, and that is, the importance of the competency will vary depending upon an individual procurement function's role and charter. And by the way, there's lots of procurement functions in the public sector that have a total of 2 or 3 procurement professionals in total. And so obviously they have to pick and choose, which competencies they want to focus on, which commodity areas they want to focus on in developing expertise. They're going to have to balance all of that with, use of co-ops as one example, right? Just one example of many examples that I could provide. And so I wanted to make sure that we acknowledge that. The survey itself, after the survey, it's an open survey still. It's currently ongoing. So far, we've received over 300 procurement leaders from across the country that have taken the survey. So the results that we're going to see reflect the responses from procurement leaders across jurisdictions, 313, I think, to be exact, in this cut of the survey. But it's an ongoing open survey. We hope to continue. We will be continuing the survey. We hope to get a lot more responses in the survey and then publish an even broader set, maybe pushing 500 to 1,000 responses over the coming 12 months or so. We'll follow up with a link to the survey, by the way, in case you haven't already taken the survey. Slide 20, please. Okay, so to start with, so what did we ask the survey respondents to do? So for each of the 17 competencies, I'm displaying the 17 competencies again here on this slide. We asked the leaders to provide a rating of 1 through 4. And these definitions of very well, reasonably well, improvement needed, and so on. These were actually defined in the survey, as were the competencies themselves. So all of that was defined. And so that's what we asked them to do, rating of 1 to 4, 4 being the best, 1 being the greatest amount of improvement needed. And not in relative terms, but competency by competency, an absolute rating. Are you doing very well, reasonably well, improvement needed, or significant improvement needed? Let me now cover slide 21, who responded to the survey. So 313 procurement leaders in total, the vast majority of whom identified themselves as a chief procurement officer or equivalent, like a senior procurement executive. Over almost 90% of the people that responded were the leaders of their procurement functions. In a few cases, the chief procurement officer delegated to a professional within their organization. But you can see, by and large, it was leaders of procurement functions that responded to the survey. Slide 22. How big were the procurement functions that the respondents were managing or leading? And you can see that they vary in size from 1 to 3 employees to 4 to 7, 8 to 20, and so on. So we have a good cross-section of different size procurement functions. Slide 23. I'd like to begin the survey results by summarizing, okay, if we go back to the competency model and we look at the 17 competencies, if I had to answer the question, which competencies received the 5 lowest ratings, meaning in need of greatest improvement, that's what's highlighted here. The darker the red, the greater the need for improvement, and that's an aggregate result across the 313 respondents. If you see competencies in white, that doesn't mean they don't need improvement. It just means that they didn't make the 5 with the lowest rating. So what's shown here are 5 with the lowest rating. I'll show the full 17 and how they fared in just a moment. But taking a look at this chart for a moment, you'll notice that Group 2 has many, many competencies. And Group 2, again, that was the group that we identified as the set of skills that really defines procurement as a profession. Again, there's a couple of different things going on here. Some of these competencies are very likely broadly applicable. Some of them are going to be a function of the role or charter of that particular procurement organization within their broader public organization, what they're asked to do. But by and large, we see some pretty significant call-outs on the part of the leaders in terms of where their top 5 competencies are that are in need of greatest improvement, that is. So spend analysis, market analysis being very, very top competencies. Group 3 again is basically taking the core skills in Group 2 and applying them across the organization in collaboration and alignment, internally with your customers, externally with the market. Market alignment and expertise came out on top as well. Not entirely surprising. We, even in procurement functions that are working very well, you can't be experts at everything. Part of it could be the result of having 2 or 3 or maybe just 4 procurement employees where you have to pick and choose what you're good at. But interesting to note that Group 2 competencies came out toward the top in terms of needing greatest improvement, as well as Group 3 in engaging with suppliers and aligning with the market in terms of developing expertise on different supply markets, different commodity areas, things like that. Not surprisingly, Group 1 did not make the 5 competencies with the lowest ratings. Group 1, that's probably what we expect the greatest amount of training and knowledge-based build-up to be, initially at least, right? Organization by organization, and that is an understanding of the policies and regulations, of the contracting process, and of course then managing the process itself. That's Group 1. So Group 2 and 3 jumped out on top. Raj, Jack, any comments or observations?
No, I think that legend is very helpful, and that I'll call it customization is very important, because any one of our teams could be strong or weak in any of those. And the legend kind of helps you benchmark, and it helps me benchmark, and then I can seek out appropriate training and seminars for our individual staff. So this, again, getting back to our specific implementation or anyone's implementation within their organization.
Yeah, if I could add also that I think in other surveys we've done, including, when we spoke with, let's say, larger organizations, including federal organizations, so we have a complement survey that we've done. We're combining all of this. We've seen similar areas, not entirely surprising, some of the results here. I will say one thing that stood out to me that didn't make the list, at least when we talked to much larger organizations on the federal side and even within states, et cetera, the requirements planning and understanding wasn't pointed as a potential area for improvement, which is sometimes a glaring hole that's pointed out. So I just wanted to point that out. There were a couple of, and we're curious, and please provide comments online if you see anything here where you've seen things similar or different.
Good point, Raj. If I could just make a side comment, requirements planning did not make the top 5 in this cut of the survey of the 313 leaders that responded. Doesn't mean that doesn't require improvement. We'll see on the next slide what all 17 look like against each other. I don't mean to mislead by this slide. If it's white, it doesn't mean it doesn't require improvement. It just means it wasn't the 5 lowest, that's all. On that note, that's a good segue into slide 24. Now let's take a look at all 17 competencies. Let me just pick up on that point that we were on. 2A, requirements planning and understanding. Clearly, it's not hugely different than some of the others. That could have been the 6th one, right? It wasn't the top 5 that required the greatest improvement, but it could have been 6th. As you can see, and again, I'll just emphasize that this is self-ratings on the part of 313 procurement leaders across jurisdictions, across different procurement function sizes, from 2-3 people within the procurement function to 50 to 100 people. And so it's an aggregation of all of that together. And so here we see that, the rating of 4 obviously corresponds to a green, and green is the highest rating, followed by orange being a 3, red, and so on. So purple is the lowest rating that leaders could give any one of these competencies. And so by and large, what you'll notice is that the vast majority of the competencies were rated, did not receive a rating of green by 75% of the respondents. And so that's the one thing I'd like to call out. So basically, procurement leaders felt that, by and large, looking across all the responses, procurement leaders felt that the vast majority of these competencies are in need of improvement. And this is this picture could look different from one organization to the other. It could look dramatically different, of course. The relative importance of these competencies, like I mentioned before, could vary significantly. The practicality in developing expertise in all of these competencies could vary significantly, especially if you've got 2 or 3 people within your procurement function, which means you need to look at other means with which to efficiently and effectively, to the degree possible, achieve procurement mission outcomes and the broader mission outcomes as well. So those are all significant moving parts. Raj, Jack, other observations from this view?
Yeah, I think I just to kind of second a couple of your points here, that there are a couple of ways to read this chart. You can start from the right and look at where there's the most pronounced red, and I think those are the areas that Ash highlighted on the previous slide, or at least some combination of those. And then, but if you look at it from the left, you can see that there's only a very few organizations that feel they're doing very well on most of these competencies. So that again begs the question of, how well and where do we want to be across all of these? And so our conclusion is that there's a vast room for improvement across a significant majority of these competencies.
As we continue, go ahead, Jeff.
My view, Raj, when I first looked at this was, in a way, it made me feel that I'm not alone with some of our challenges. Across, I'll call it a larger grouping of professionals. What I was seeing in my little local environment here was consistent with what other leaders were facing. So again, it allowed us to very quickly prioritize where our training resources should be applied.
Right.
Great, fantastic. And as we continue to collect more and more responses, we'll keep an eye, we'll create updated versions of this cut that we're looking at here, as well as the top 5 competencies, top 5 meaning the 5 requiring greatest improvement. We'll continue to update that on a regular basis, whenever it's reasonable, that is, right? So right now we have 300 some responses, maybe the next cut is at 500 or 600 and so on.
And by the way, I was going to say that our goal is, while we've helped build out and kind of collaborated on building out this competency model, we are working very closely with all the associations and many of the leaders that you all know, as well as many other experts out there, to make sure that, we see this through all the way to where we have this, hopefully, a big part of this chart being green. And so that's our goal, and we're committed to that. And so we hope that as we continue to update this over time too, just like Jack, you said you're going to go back and update your chart that you showed earlier. We will continue to do that, and we hope that as a profession we continue to move all of these, the green, more and more on this chart.
Yeah, I agree. I'd like to see on an annual basis, redoing this every year once we have even more responses than this. It would be very, very good to see the subsequent annual responses getting better and better. One more thing before we move toward Q&A, as I want to make sure we have enough time for Q&A, and that is I wanted to show you a view of the 5 competencies with the lowest rating and how they did or did not vary across different procurement function sizes. By and large, the key takeaway on this slide here, on slide 25, is that there was a good consistency across different procurement function sizes. When you look at the largest procurement function size to the far right column, those were procurement functions with 25 to 50 professionals within them. There's a couple that tied for 5th place, and then one notably, that is item number 2F, risk analysis and management, made it to the competency rated the second most improvement required, right? The second greatest improvement required, that is. And that was risk analysis and management. So that was the only one that jumped into the top 5 that we didn't see for procurement function sizes of 20 people and less. But for the most part, you'll see spend analysis across the row there, rated either first or second. And then market alignment and expertise, by and large, came in 2nd place, first in one instance, but second. And so not entirely. So the point is, it's a very good. I don't know if frankly, I don't know if it's good or bad to see this consistency, but there is consistency, and that's my observation.
I'm curious, Jack, and others as well, if you'd like to chime in online. When you look at spend analysis, Jack, I have my own kind of conclusions on why that's red and why it's still an area that's being developed. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on why this is not an area that's as proficient as others.
Because I think until recently did we have, some, I'll call it integrated tools with whatever our accounting systems were to look at things more timely. And my experience has been, it's been always looking, in the past, and sometimes the tools that were not sufficient to get us timely data. So they weren't, we were always looking at, 6 months, in some cases a year behind, which it's hard to be actionable when you have that data.
Mm-hmm.
My case here, you guys might recall that one of the first things I said to my staff is, what's the size of my portfolio? And even that was a difficult number to get, because we had to go into we use Oracle. And so very quickly they built me a dashboard that I now have real-time information on my desktop every morning. And the data was there. We just didn't have the tool to extract it so we could look at it, like I said, more, in a more real-time manner.
Yeah, and that's what we've seen, Jack, as well. Some of the data is just starting to come together, so hopefully we'll start to see that area grow as well. Ash, I just wanted to highlight a question that just came in by Ashley. Will a certification program be available to test for these competencies? Will NIGP be using the data to update the competencies that it tests for? Funny you ask. We are actually working with NIGP, NASPO, and others, and the UPPCC board actually to exactly look at that. So we are engaged with them right now, and we will be meeting with them. But this is exactly the discussion we're having, is how do we update and align with these competencies and continue to evolve the certification process. So that's in process.
Okay, great. Let's see. Let's move on to slide number 27. And by the way, so that's a quick summary of the results from the national survey. And again, if you haven't already taken the survey, please do so. We'll send a follow-up after the webinar. And we'll continue to expand the results as more respondents provide input into the survey itself. Slide 27 then, just as a reminder again, we're going to pick up this series with webinar 2 for April 24th, where we're going to expand on how organizations can deploy the competency model. But Jack presented for the County of San Diego, part of what Jack presented was the role competency alignment matrix. And so we'll be taking a deeper dive into that for the second webinar on April 24th. So this piqued your interest, so please do participate, please do attend that webinar as well. Let me tee up and summarize a few next steps. I'm glad that we've already begun the Q&A discussion, since we're 6 minutes technically over the time, but we've already begun the Q&A, so that's good. I'd like to just briefly summarize the next steps on slide 29. Some of this I may have already covered, but just to summarize it all, we're happy to follow up with online meetings to receive any further feedback that attendees may have and how we can help in regards to the competency model, roles within your organization, aligning therein, etc. So we're happy to set up those follow-up online meetings. Just feel free to reach out to us, and we'll send out a follow-up in that regard as well. As I've already mentioned, we will be updating the national survey with more responses, and we'll send out a follow-up link to where you can find the survey in case you haven't already taken it. We're also in the process of putting out an updated report on the state of the public procurement workforce. It's meant to capture all of the work over the last couple of years, the latest version of the competency model, the latest set of tools that we've been developing over the past couple of years as well. We expect to have that available on our website over the next 2 to 3 months at the very latest. So definitely within the 2 to 3 month time frame. And as Raj mentioned a moment ago, we're actually collaborating with UPPCC and stakeholders on credentials and workforce development strategies. So a lot of this work is obviously ongoing. This, for us, this is the beginning of something good where we can help affect and drive forward the public procurement workforce with a set of standards that helps define what those key skills are and how they can be utilized, practically speaking, within organizations that have different charters, different resources, etc. Raj, anything to add?
No, I think that's it. I think maybe I can just pose a question that is at the bottom here. I know this may be difficult to have a real engaging online discussion here. That's why we encourage you to let us know if you'd like to potentially join an online meeting as mentioned here, so where we can all talk and discuss this more in a live fashion. But having said that, if you can just chime in, and Jack, I'm just curious from your perspective as well, what do you believe are the most critical next steps? You're taking some of them in your organization, but if you were, maybe you can talk about it from a profession standpoint. What do you believe are the most critical next steps to really adopt this model and hope continue to really build a world-class public procurement workforce?
Sure. I think part of it is the small steps individually we can take in each of our organization, and then in conjunction with some of the alliances and contacts that you're working with, NIGP, NCMA, the certification organizations that are providing certification to offer, I'll call it, training sessions, interchange abilities to help us improve in these areas. I mean, the whole, whether it be spend analysis, whether it be cost price analysis, some of those areas that I call underserved, with the professionals organizations focusing on those areas and sharing information to the larger, broader community will benefit each of our organizations individually. So I think that's the logical next step you're taking it, and then have each individual scale it for where it makes sense to their workforce.
Great. No, I like that you're also encouraging kind of individual organizations, because we do believe it's you know, from just a change standpoint, whenever you take on something like this, we would just advise from a change standpoint, it's always, you know, you need some, let's call them macro level changes. So that's where the organizations, associations, et cetera, come in. So that's more of a profession-wide change in certification process, maybe training tools that are provided by others. But that each individual organization needs to really look at their context and what they're doing specifically and how they can adapt to it. So great advice, Jack. Does anybody else have any comments? We don't see any comments or right now any, and there's a comment that just came in. Ashley is asking if we can send a link to the survey with a copy of the presentation. Certainly, and we'd love to see more responses on the survey. So absolutely, we'll send that out.
I think as part of the same follow-up, another attendee asked, please ensure, I'll just read it verbatim, please ensure attendees are invited for the 424 webinar. So we'll be sure to do that as well.
Great.
Okay, I don't see any other comments or questions as well. I'm glad we fielded a couple in real time. It was most natural to do it as we were going through the discussion and the slides that we were covering. So that's great. Raj, any closing comments?
No, I just encourage everyone to look at some of this material, and we'll be issuing an accompanying report soon as well. And definitely reach out to us. This is important work. We believe, I'll just say, and Jack, you've heard me talk about this before, we feel very strongly about a strong workforce, and we feel we owe it to our people, to give them the guidance, the tools, so they can really achieve their best potential. And so we partly believe that there is work to be done for the profession and for each individual. So we're excited about this work, if you can't tell already, and we'd love to really get others engaged. We're lucky that many are already, and so we just stress that, reach out to us, please, and let us know whether you don't agree with something, or you have some other critical feedback, or however you may want to help. I think that's really important, that all of this is done in a very inclusive, collaborative way. That's the only way we can advance all of this.
So, Raj, if I may, I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak today and participate, and thank you for being the bridge. I view you guys as the bridge to start this discussion on this important work, and you're the bridge between, I'll call it, practical implementation and the higher order body of knowledge. So thank you for doing that. And anyone on the line, feel free to contact me directly if you want to get into the down and dirty details of how I rolled this out of my organization. Mm-hmm. And the great thing about our profession is it's all public information. It's all, if we share it, there's no secrets among us.
Well, and Jack, thank you. I also, I know Josh and I and all of us at Public Spend Forum, others are appreciative and really appreciate all the work that you and your team have done, and we think you're setting a great example for others as well. So I would second that. Reach out to Jack, please, and he can share all his lessons there.
Okay, great. Raj, Jack, thank you. Attendees, thanks to all the attendees for coming online and showing their interest and showing their keen interest, I should say, in this very important topic. We hope to see all of you again next time, and perhaps several more as well toward the end of April. Like I mentioned, we'll send out follow-ups in regards to the survey and the upcoming webinar at the end of April. Thank you again. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.